My father threw away my acceptance letter to Harvard. I found out 12 years later at my brother's lavish wedding when my aunt had one too many drinks and slurred the truth across the VIP table. "You know your dad hid that letter, right?" She laughed loudly. We all knew. I looked at my father expecting denial, or at least a flicker of shame. Instead, he cut his steak, smiled, and said you would not have lasted a single semester anyway. What I pulled out of my purse next made that arrogant smile disappear permanently. "My name is Valerie. I am 30 years old. Before I tell you how I dismantled my father's entire life piece by piece, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. If you have ever had a toxic family member try to sabotage your future, hit the like button and subscribe, because you are going to love how this ends." The crystal chandeliers of the grand estate in Atlanta cast a warm golden glow over the 200 guests. The sprawling grounds were covered in imported white roses and the finest silk drapery. It was a $250,000 wedding funded mostly by family debt and desperate attempts to maintain an illusion of extreme wealth. I was seated at the main family table dressed in a tailored emerald gown that my mother had spent all morning criticizing for being too understated. The jazz band was playing softly in the background when Aunt Yvonne knocked over her third martini. The sharp clinking of her glass against the fine china silenced the immediate area. That was when she leaned forward, pointing a manicured finger at me, and dropped the secret my family had kept for over a decade. The jazz music seemed to fade into a hollow ringing in my ears. I sat perfectly still. The heavy silver fork in my hand suddenly felt like an anchor weighing me down. 12 years ago, I had waited by the mailbox every single day, hoping for that thick envelope from Cambridge. When the rejection letter arrived, I cried until my lungs burned, and I could not breathe. I had spent my entire high school career studying until 3 in the morning, joining every debate club and running myself into the ground just to earn a ticket out of my father's oppressive household. And now, my aunt sitting there with smeared red lipstick was casually telling me that the acceptance letter had actually arrived first. I turned my head slowly and looked at my father, Elias. He was a man who demanded total obedience, a man who built a logistics company and expected everyone to bow to his perceived power. I waited for him to snap at Yvonne, to call her a liar, to do anything a normal father would do to protect his daughter. Instead, he casually wiped his mouth with a linen napkin. He did not look apologetic in the slightest. He looked annoyed that his expensive dinner was interrupted. Then he leaned back in his chair, letting a cold, arrogant smirk spread across his face. "You know, Yvonne?" He said, his voice completely steady. "She should be thanking me. Harvard would have eaten her alive. She was always too soft." I saved her the embarrassment of failing out. The sheer audacity of his words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. I looked over at my mother, Vivian, hoping for some shred of maternal defense or at least a gasp of shock. But just like every other time in my life, she looked down at her plate, avoiding my eyes entirely. "Oh, Elias, do not start this now," she whispered nervously, adjusting her diamond necklace. "Valerie, let it go. It is your brother's big day. We need to keep the peace." Keep the peace. That was my mother's favorite phrase. It was the phrase she used when my father bought my younger brother Jordan a brand new sports car for his 16th birthday, while telling me I had to take out high-interest student loans for a state college. It was the phrase she used when they gave Jordan a massive down payment for a luxury condo while I was working double shifts as a waitress just to afford my law school textbooks. A deep, suffocating heat began to rise in my chest. For years I had internalized their neglect and carried it like a heavy stone. I had genuinely believed I was the problem. I thought I was not smart enough, not driven enough, not worthy of the same investment they poured so freely into my brother. The sheer cruelty of hiding that letter was not just about control. It was about making sure I never realized my own power. My father had stolen my dream not because I was not capable, but because he could not stand the thought of me outshining his golden child. He needed me to stay small so he could feel big. I took a slow, deep breath, forcing my heart rate to steady. I could feel the textured leather of my handbag resting against my leg. Inside that bag was a set of documents that were going to change the trajectory of our entire family bloodline. I did not scream. I did not flip the table or burst into tears the way the old Valerie would have done. I simply picked up my crystal water glass and took a slow, measured sip. My silence seemed to unnerve my father much more than a screaming match would have. His smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he puffed his chest out again, trying to regain his dominance. "Are you not going to say anything, Valerie?" he taunted, picking up his wine glass. "Or are you going to sit there and pout all night like a child?" Before I could formulate an answer, the sound of expensive high heels clicking sharply against the marble floor drew our attention. It was Chelsea, my brother's new wife, making her way toward our table with a piece of paper in her hand and a very familiar look of disdain on her perfectly contoured face. Chelsea stood right behind my chair, but my father held up a hand to stop her before she could speak. He was not finished with me yet. He needed to make sure the narrative was firmly back in his control. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and laced his fingers together. He looked at me with a mixture of pity and disgust, which was his signature expression whenever I dared to exist outside of his shadow. "You need to understand something, Valerie," he said, his voice projecting just loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. "I did what a father is supposed to do. I protected you from your own limitations. You were always a fragile girl. You cried over a bad grade in chemistry. You stayed up all night worrying about debate tournaments. Harvard is a place for sharks. It is a place for people with iron wills and the right pedigree. You would have gone up there to Massachusetts and crumbled within the first month. You would have embarrassed yourself, and more importantly, you would have embarrassed this family. I saved you the humiliation of packing your bags and coming home a failure. The gaslighting was so masterfully executed that I could actually see a few of my aunts and uncles nodding along in agreement. They were buying it. In their eyes, Elias was the benevolent patriarch making the tough choices for his emotionally unstable daughter. He was rewriting history right in front of my eyes. He completely omitted the fact that I was the valedictorian of my class. He conveniently forgot that my tears over that chemistry grade were because he threatened to kick me out of the house if I did not maintain a perfect GPA. He was taking my dedication, my anxiety born from his own abuse, and weaponizing it to justify stealing my future. My mother, Vivian, reached out and placed her cold hand over mine. Her fingers felt like ice. I looked at her, expecting to see at least a glimmer of conflict, but her eyes were completely blank. She had sacrificed her own soul to stay married to this man, and she expected me to do the same. "Your father is right, Valerie," she whispered, leaning in close so the guests could not hear the venom in her tone. "You were always too sensitive for your own good. You did not have the social grace for an Ivy League school. You would not have known how to network with those wealthy families. You should be grateful he shielded you from that harsh environment. Now I want you to wipe that sullen look off your face. You are ruining the aesthetic of your brother's wedding. People are starting to stare at us. Apologize to your father right now for looking at him with such disrespect, and let us get back to celebrating Jordan." I sat there and looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I studied the way her heavy diamond earrings pulled at her earlobes. I noticed the slight tremor in her hand and the desperate way she glanced around the room to ensure no one was witnessing a crack in our perfect family facade. She was a woman entirely consumed by appearances. To her, it did not matter that my father had committed a profound act of betrayal. All that mattered was that we smiled for the photographer and presented a united front to the other elite families of Atlanta. She was asking me to apologize to the man who derailed my life just so she could finish her expensive meal in peace. I remained completely silent. I did not pull my hand away from hers, and I did not look away from her face. My silence was a new tactic, and it clearly unsettled them. For my entire life, their psychological abuse relied on my reaction. They expected me to argue, to defend myself, to cry, or to storm out. That was the dance we had always done. It allowed them to point fingers and call me the crazy one, the unstable daughter who always ruined family gatherings. But tonight I gave them absolutely nothing. I was a brick wall. I shifted my gaze back to my father. Underneath his expensive tailored tuxedo, I could see the subtle signs of a man who was losing his grip. A small bead of sweat had formed at his temple. His breathing was just a fraction too fast. He was waiting for me to explode, but my calm demeanor was reflecting his own ugliness back at him. I realized in that moment that he was not a powerful patriarch at all. He was just a terrified little man who had to crush his own daughter's dreams because he was completely devoid of any real accomplishments himself. The logistics company he loved to brag about was currently bleeding money. The country club memberships were hanging by a thread. His entire identity was built on bullying women and propping up my useless brother. My quiet observation stretched on for a full minute. The tension at the table became suffocating. Aunt Yvonne had sobered up just enough to realize the magnitude of what she had unleashed, and she was staring down at her napkin in terrified silence. The other relatives stopped chewing their food. Even the clinking of silverware faded away. My father's smirk finally dissolved, completely replaced by a deep flush of genuine anger. He hated being ignored. He hated that his grand speech did not break me down into a puddle of apologies. "Are you deaf as well as ungrateful?" he hissed, leaning across the table. "Your mother told you to apologize." I slowly pulled my hand out from under my mother's grip. I picked up my linen napkin and dabbed the corners of my mouth, moving with deliberate, agonizing slowness. I was savoring the moment. I was savoring the knowledge that they had absolutely no idea who they were dealing with. They thought they were bullying the same helpless 18-year-old girl they had discarded 12 years ago. They thought I was just a lowly paralegal scraping by in a tiny apartment. They had no concept of the power I wielded or the financial guillotine that was currently hanging over their heads. I let my eyes drift away from my father's furious face and looked up at Chelsea, who was still standing behind me clutching that piece of paper. Her arrival had been delayed by my father's desperate need to gaslight me, but she was practically vibrating with the need to deliver her own insult. I gave her a small, polite smile, practically inviting her to take her best shot. She shifted her weight from one expensive stiletto to the other, clearly annoyed that she had to wait her turn to humiliate me. Chelsea had always viewed me as the weakest link in her new family, a convenient target to elevate her own status. She wanted to prove to my parents that she belonged in their circle by joining in on their favorite pastime, which was tearing me down. I adjusted my posture in the heavy mahogany chair, feeling the solid weight of my bag against my ankle. The stage was set perfectly. My father had dug his grave with his toxic justifications, and my mother had willingly jumped in right beside him. Now it was the bride's turn to hand me the shovel. Chelsea adjusted the bodice of her custom silk gown, a dress that cost more than my mother ever made in a year. She looked down her nose at me, her perfectly highlighted blonde hair catching the light of the chandeliers above us. Without a word of greeting, she slapped a crisp piece of paper directly onto my dessert plate. It landed right on top of my untouched slice of red velvet cake, staining the bottom edge with crimson frosting. I looked down at it. It was an invoice from the most exclusive floral designer in Atlanta. The total at the bottom was bolded and circled in red ink: $15,000. I looked back up at her, waiting for her to explain this ridiculous gesture. There was no explanation, just pure malice. Chelsea crossed her arms, her heavy diamond engagement ring flashing aggressively in my face. "Jordan told me you did not bring a physical gift to the reception," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "So I figured this would be a great way for you to actually contribute to this family for once. You can just cover the flowers. Consider it your way of making up for sitting here with that miserable look on your face all night." I glanced at the invoice, and then back at her face, keeping my expression completely neutral. I asked her if she seriously expected me to pay her floral bill. Chelsea rolled her eyes and sighed loudly, as if she were explaining basic math to a toddler. "Well, yes, Valerie," she snapped. "You are his older sister. It is embarrassing enough that you showed up in a dress that looks like it was bought off the rack at a cheap department store, but to show up empty-handed to a wedding of this caliber is just tacky. We know you are not exactly rolling in cash. Jordan told me all about your little job. What is it again? A paralegal? A public defender? Some lowly legal assistant scraping the bottom of the barrel in New York? She let out a sharp little laugh that grated against my ears. I know 15,000 is probably half your yearly salary, but you can put it on a credit card. Or maybe you can set up a payment plan. I do not really care how you handle it, just get it paid before the florist calls my father and makes us look bad to our friends. I am not having my perfect day ruined by your cheapness. My parents watched this entire exchange without intervening at all. My father actually looked pleased that his new daughter-in-law was putting me in my place. He took a slow sip of his wine, watching me intently to see if I would finally break under the weight of the humiliation. My mother just looked away, pretending to be utterly fascinated by the ice sculpture in the center of the room. She was fully complicit in this silent attack. Before I could formulate a response, Jordan suddenly appeared behind Chelsea. He wrapped his arms around her narrow waist and rested his chin affectionately on her shoulder. He was wearing a custom tuxedo and a smile so blindingly fake it belonged on a billboard. He kissed her cheek and gave me a look of pure mock sympathy. "Now, babe, do not be too hard on Val," he said, his tone laced with that fake brotherly concern I had hated since childhood. "You know she struggles to make ends meet. She does not have the kind of capital we are used to working with in our circles. I can handle the florist bill tomorrow. It is just pocket change anyway." Chelsea pouted, leaning back into his embrace and stroking his arm. "But Jordan, she should contribute something. It is the principle of the matter." Jordan chuckled, a rich, hearty sound designed specifically to make sure everyone at the neighboring tables heard him playing the generous billionaire. I know," he said soothingly, "but we cannot squeeze blood from a turnip. Besides, you know my tech company is closing that $10 million investment round by the end of the month. Once that venture capital clears, 15 grand is going to feel like a drop in the ocean. I am going to buy you that villa in Tuscany we talked about. Let my sister keep her little paycheck to pay her rent in her tiny apartment. The $10 million investment." He said it with such absolute conviction that I almost burst out laughing right there at the table. He was standing there in a rented tuxedo at a wedding paid for by mounting debt, bragging about a tech startup that had not produced a single line of viable code in over 3 years. He was playing the part of the young tech mogul perfectly, and Chelsea was eating right out of the palm of his hand. She genuinely believed she had married into absolute royalty. She had no idea that the $10 million was not venture capital from a prestigious firm. It was a predatory high-interest loan that our father had secretly guaranteed by putting a second mortgage on the family estate. They were all standing on a fragile trap door, and they were handing me the lever to pull it open. I looked at Jordan, breathing in the strong scent of his expensive cologne. I looked at Chelsea, who was staring at me with a triumphant smirk, fully convinced she had successfully humiliated the poor spinster sister. And I looked at my parents, who were beaming with pride at their successful, wealthy son and his beautiful new bride. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully shoved me back into the tiny little box they had built for me 12 years ago. The air in the room felt thick and electric, heavy with the weight of their combined arrogance. I slowly reached down toward the floor, my fingers brushing against the smooth, expensive leather of my handbag. It was time to end this charade once and for all. I unclasped the gold hardware of my handbag and pulled out my wallet. Chelsea was still standing there with her arms crossed, shifting her weight and waiting for me to pull out a maxed-out basic credit card or break down in tears and beg for mercy. I could feel the eyes of my parents and my Aunt Yvonne burning into the side of my face. I opened the slim leather wallet and bypassed the standard corporate cards, the everyday bank debit cards, and the membership IDs. My fingers found the cold, heavy titanium edge of my American Express Centurion card. The black card. It is not something you can just apply for online or ask a bank teller to issue. You have to be invited, and to be invited you have to spend and pay off hundreds of thousands of dollars a year in personal expenses alone. It is the ultimate symbol of quiet, invisible wealth, and it was currently sitting between my index and middle finger. I pulled it out and placed it flat on the table right next to the floral invoice. The matte black metal absorbed the light from the chandeliers overhead, looking almost dangerously heavy against the pristine white tablecloth. There was a fraction of a second where no one quite understood what they were looking at. Chelsea blinked her heavily lashed eyes, staring down at the card like it was an alien artifact. Jordan leaned in closer, his brow furrowing as he tried to process why my card looked so thick and dark compared to his own platinum cards. Just then, the banquet manager, a polished older man in a pristine white tuxedo jacket, happened to be walking past our table to check on the champagne service. I lifted my hand and signaled him over with a subtle flick of my wrist. "Excuse me," I said, my voice calm and perfectly steady, cutting through the tension at the table. "I need you to run this card for the floral invoice sitting right there. Pay the $15,000 in full and please add a $5,000 tip for the floral design team for setting up such beautiful arrangements tonight. Put it all on this card." The manager looked down at the table. The moment his trained eyes registered the unmistakable design of the black card, his entire posture shifted. He did not look at Chelsea, who was glaring at him, or Jordan, who was suddenly very still, or even my father, who was supposedly the wealthy patriarch funding this entire extravagant event. The manager looked directly at me with a deep, respectful nod, recognizing instantly who held the real power at this table. "Right away, madam," he said, his voice hushed with sudden reverence. "I will process this immediately and bring you the receipt." He carefully picked up the heavy metal card and the paper invoice, placing them on his silver serving tray. He turned away and walked briskly toward the back office, moving with urgent purpose. The silence that fell over the family table was absolute and suffocating. The background chatter of the wedding reception, the clinking of glasses, and the soft jazz music seemed to fade out completely, leaving only the sound of Chelsea breathing heavily. She looked from the empty space on the table where the invoice had been up to my face, and then over to Jordan. Her mouth opened and closed a few times, but no words came out. Her arrogant facade was starting to crack. Jordan swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight tuxedo collar. "Val, what exactly was that?" he asked, his fake billionaire persona slipping away for just a second, revealing the panicked little boy underneath. "Was that a company card? Did your law firm give you a corporate expense card for emergencies? Because if you just charged $20,000 to your boss for a personal event, you are going to get fired and sued by Monday morning." I looked at my brother and smiled a genuine, completely relaxed smile. "No, Jordan," I replied softly, picking up my water glass again. "My firm does not issue black cards to paralegals." My father was staring at me. His jaw clenched so tightly a muscle was twitching visibly in his cheek. He was a veteran businessman who understood the rigid, unyielding hierarchies of wealth. He knew exactly what that card meant, and his brain was frantically short-circuiting, trying to reconcile the helpless, obedient daughter he had rejected 12 years ago with the woman sitting in front of him, tossing around $20,000 like it was pocket change. Vivian. My mother had gone completely pale under her expensive makeup. She gripped her linen napkin, her knuckles turning white as she realized that the narrative she had carefully constructed about her poor, struggling spinster daughter was violently falling apart right in front of her high society friends. Chelsea let out a nervous, high-pitched giggle, trying desperately to regain control of the situation and her own crumbling reality. "Oh, please," she scoffed, waving her hand dismissively in the air. "It is probably a fake. You can buy novelty metal cards online to look rich on Instagram. She is just trying to embarrass us and stall for time. She is probably going to bounce a check or the machine will decline it." But the waver in her voice betrayed her escalating panic. She kept watching the arched doorway where the manager had disappeared, her eyes wide with desperate hope that he would come back out and declare the card declined. Less than 2 minutes later, the manager returned. He was holding the silver tray with both hands, walking with measured dignity. He approached my side of the table, bowing slightly as he presented the tray directly to me. "The transaction was approved seamlessly, madam," he said smoothly, his voice carrying easily to everyone at the table. "Here is your receipt and your card. The floral team has been notified of your extremely generous gratuity, and they send their deepest thanks." Can I get you anything else, perhaps a fresh bottle of our vintage champagne for the table? I picked up the heavy black card and slid it back into my leather wallet, taking my time to secure the gold clasp with a satisfying click. No, thank you, I said, looking up at him. I think I am about to give a speech. The manager bowed again and stepped away, melting back into the crowd. Chelsea stared fixedly at the printed receipt resting on the white tablecloth. The bold numbers confirming a $20,000 charge, approved without hesitation, stared back at her. The color drained completely from her face, leaving her looking sickly and drawn. She looked like she was going to pass out. The arrogant bride who had just tried to publicly humiliate me over a floral bill was now standing there, realizing she had just insulted someone with infinitely more power and liquid capital than she could even comprehend. Her shoulders slumped and she took a small, unsteady step backward, bumping into Jordan. I placed my linen napkin carefully on the table and slowly pushed my heavy mahogany chair back. The wood scraped against the marble floor, echoing loudly in the tense, frozen silence of our family table. I stood up, smoothing the front of my emerald silk gown, making sure every fold fell perfectly into place. For 12 long years, I had shrunk myself to make them comfortable. For 12 years, I had let them control the narrative of my life, casting me as the failure so Jordan could play the king. But standing there, looking down at my father's terrified, wide eyes and my brother's pale, sweating face, I felt a surge of absolute, intoxicating authority. I picked up my clutch and stepped away from the table. I did not look back at them. Instead, I turned my gaze toward the grand stage at the front of the ballroom, where a microphone stood waiting on a beautifully draped podium. It was time for the sister of the groom to say a few words. I walked toward the stage with slow, deliberate steps. The heavy silk of my emerald gown brushed softly against the polished marble floor. Every eye in the room followed me. The jazz band had stopped playing. The sudden silence in the grand ballroom was deafening, broken only by the sharp click of my heels. I looked out over the sea of tables. I saw the faces of my father's business associates. The major investors he had invited to this wedding were seated in the prime spots near the dance floor. Men in expensive tailored suits who held the fate of his failing logistics company in their hands. Men he had been trying to impress all evening by parading Jordan and Chelsea around like prized show ponies. My father realized exactly what I was doing. His chair scraped violently against the floor as he jumped to his feet. "Valerie, get back here right now," he hissed, his voice carrying easily across the quiet room. "You are not on the schedule to speak. This is not your moment." I ignored him and kept walking. I reached the short flight of velvet-covered stairs leading up to the stage. My mother was frantically tugging at his tuxedo jacket, begging him to sit down and stop making a scene, but his panic had completely overridden his desire to keep the peace. He knew that I held the black card. He knew that the balance of power had shifted at that family table, but he still falsely believed he controlled the venue. I stepped up to the clear acrylic podium and adjusted the slender microphone. I tapped the top of it twice. The low thud echoed through the massive speakers placed strategically around the room. "Testing. Testing," I said, leaning forward slightly. My voice sounded rich and steady, filling every corner of the lavish space. My father lost his mind. He turned away from our table and looked wildly toward the back of the room where the venue security team was stationed. There were 4 large men in dark suits standing near the exit doors. The head of security, a tall, broad-shouldered man named Derek, was watching the stage with a neutral expression. "Derek, get her off that stage," my father barked, pointing a shaking finger at me. "I did not authorize any speeches from her. She is drunk and trying to ruin my son's wedding. Remove her from the premises immediately." The room gasped. My father had just openly ordered security to drag his own daughter out of her brother's wedding reception. The wealthy investors at the front tables exchanged shocked glances, whispering behind their hands. Chelsea looked thrilled. She practically bounced on her toes, waiting to watch me be humiliated and physically escorted out by large men. Jordan crossed his arms, looking smug, assuming his father had just solved the problem. But Derek did not move. He did not signal his men. He did not reach for his radio. He simply stood there with his hands clasped behind his back, perfectly still. My father's face turned a dangerous shade of crimson. The vein in his forehead bulged against his skin. "Did you not hear me?" he yelled, stepping away from his table and walking toward the center of the room. "I rented this entire estate. I am paying your exorbitant hourly rate. I said get that woman away from the microphone right now before I have your job." Derek slowly shifted his gaze from me to my father. He looked at the raging patriarch with a mixture of pity and professional indifference. "I am sorry, Sir Derek," said his voice calm and resonant, easily carrying through the silent ballroom. "But my instructions do not come from you." My father froze in his tracks. He blinked rapidly, completely disoriented by the insubordination. "What are you talking about?" he demanded, his voice cracking slightly. "I signed the contract for this venue. I wrote the check for the deposit. I am the client." "Actually, sir, you are not the client," Derek replied respectfully but firmly. "Your initial deposit check bounced 3 days ago. The venue was scheduled to be cancelled entirely. However, a private corporate entity stepped in and paid the full balance for the evening, along with a premium hazard fee to ensure the event could proceed. My team takes direct orders only from the primary account holder." The color drained from my father's face so fast he looked physically ill. The great Elias, the proud owner of a logistics empire, the man who had spent his entire life bullying his family with his financial weight, had just been publicly outed for bouncing a check for his own son's wedding. The whispers from the investor tables grew louder. I could see them leaning into each other, shaking their heads. The illusion of my father's extreme wealth was shattering into a million pieces right there on the marble floor. My father turned slowly to look at me standing behind the podium. His eyes darted down to the leather clutch sitting next to the microphone, the same bag where I had just returned the black Centurion card. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. He stumbled backward slightly, his hand reaching blindly for the back of an empty chair to steady himself. I leaned into the microphone, letting a soft, confident smile touch my lips. "Thank you, Derek," I said, projecting my voice clearly. "Please ensure no one leaves the room until I have finished. We have some important family matters to discuss, and I would hate for anyone to miss the truth." Derek nodded curtly, and the 4 security guards stepped sideways, physically blocking the massive oak exit doors. The soft click of the heavy brass locks engaging echoed through the room. My father was trapped. Chelsea was trapped. Jordan was trapped. The arrogant family that had spent over a decade making me feel like an unwelcome guest in my own home was now completely at my mercy. I adjusted the microphone one more time, looking directly into my father's terrified eyes. It was time to pull the first thread and unravel the massive lie they called a life. The heavy oak doors of the ballroom were locked. The soft hum of the air conditioning was the only sound in the massive space. I stood at the acrylic podium, looking down at the family that had systematically tried to destroy my confidence for my entire adult life. My father was still standing near his table, his chest heaving with every ragged breath he took. His eyes were wide, filled with a feral kind of panic. He was a trapped animal, realizing for the first time that the cage he had built for me was actually locking him inside. My mother had buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly, not out of guilt, but out of absolute mortification that her perfect society friends were witnessing this spectacle. I wrapped my hands around the edges of the podium, gripping the cool plastic to ground myself. I leaned closer to the microphone. "Less than 20 minutes ago, my father told all of you a very compelling story," I said, my voice echoing clearly off the high vaulted ceilings. "He stood right there and told you that he intercepted my acceptance letter to Harvard University to protect me. He painted a picture of a fragile, unstable girl who would have crumbled under the pressure of an Ivy League education. He told you he saved me from failure. It was a beautiful narrative, carefully crafted to make him look like a loving, protective patriarch, making the hard choices for his daughter." I paused, letting my eyes sweep across the front tables where his major investors were seated. They were hanging on my every word. Several of them had put their drinks down and were leaning forward completely engrossed. But like everything else in my father's life, that story was a beautifully decorated lie, I continued. He did not hide that letter because he was worried about my mental health. He hid it because he was terrified. He was terrified because the day that acceptance letter arrived, he realized he was going to have to write a check for tuition. And he knew that the college trust fund my grandfather had set up for me, an account that was supposed to hold over $200,000, was completely empty. My father flinched, as if I had physically struck him. He opened his mouth to shout something to deny it, but the words died in his throat. He looked at the security guards blocking the doors and realized nobody was coming to save him. You see, my father is not the brilliant logistics mastermind he pretends to be. I said, my voice dropping to a colder, sharper register. He is a man with a very expensive and very destructive underground gambling addiction. 12 years ago, right around the time I was studying until dawn and burning myself out to secure a scholarship, he was spending his nights in the back rooms of illegal high-stakes poker games in Buckhead. He was losing tens of thousands of dollars a week trying to play with men who had real money. When his debts got too high and the men he owed started making physical threats against him, he panicked. He did not sell his expensive cars. He did not downsize this ridiculous lifestyle. Instead, he quietly emptied his 18-year-old daughter's college trust fund to save his own legs from being broken. A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. The wealthy women from my mother's church clutched their pearls, exchanging horrified whispers. The men in the tailored suits, the investors my father desperately needed to keep his business afloat, began pulling out their phones, discreetly typing out messages. The illusion of Elias, the self-made billionaire, was evaporating into thin air. He was being exposed not just as a bad father, but as a massive financial liability. A man who would steal from his own child to cover his gambling debts was not a man anyone in that room would ever trust with their investment capital. Vivian. Please, my father whispered, looking down at my mother, begging her to intervene. Tell her to stop. Make her stop. But my mother did not look up. She kept her face hidden, paralyzed by the social ruin raining down around her. She had known. In that moment, looking at her cowering figure, I realized she had known about the stolen money all along. She had watched me cry over those student loan applications, and she had chosen to protect her husband's dirty secrets over her daughter's future. The betrayal cut deep, but it only fueled my focus. I shifted my gaze from my broken father to the golden child. Jordan was standing next to his bride, his posture rigid. He was staring at me with a mixture of anger and deep-seated fear. He thought he was safe from the crossfire. He thought this was just between me and our dad. And then there is Jordan, I said, saying his name loud enough to make him jump. My brother, the so-called tech genius, the golden child who could do no wrong. While I was working 2 jobs to pay my way through a state university, Jordan miraculously got accepted into a prestigious private college, despite having a high school grade point average that barely hovered above failing. For years, my parents paraded him around, bragging about his academic turnaround. They told everyone he was a late bloomer who simply needed the right environment to thrive. I reached into the leather binder I had placed on the podium and pulled out a single sheet of paper, holding it up for the room to see. It was a printed bank statement. But miracles are expensive, I said, my eyes locking onto Jordan's pale face. After my father paid off his bookies with my college fund, he had about $40,000 left over from the theft. He did not put it back. He did not give it to me to help with my textbooks or my rent. He used every single cent of that stolen money to make a quiet, untraceable donation to the admissions board of Jordan's college. He literally bought my brother's acceptance letter with the money he stole from me. You did not earn your way into that school, Jordan. You were purchased. And you were purchased with my future. Jordan stumbled backward, hitting the edge of his table. Chelsea pulled her hand away from his arm, looking at him as if he had suddenly contracted a contagious disease. Her entire world was built on the idea that she had married an intellectual titan, a man destined for greatness. Now she was staring at a fraud who could not even get into college without his daddy bribing the admissions office with stolen money. The ballroom was buzzing now, a hive of shocked whispers and blatant stares. My father was leaning heavily against his chair, his breathing labored as the absolute destruction of his reputation washed over him. But I was not finished. Exposing the past was only the prologue. They had stolen my past, but I had meticulously, systematically, and legally purchased their entire future. I placed the bank statement back onto the podium and took a deep breath, ready to tear down the very walls they were standing inside. "That is a complete fabrication," my father roared, his voice cracking under the strain of his own panic. He pushed himself away from the table, his chair tipping backward and crashing loudly onto the marble floor. He pointed a trembling finger at the podium. "Do not listen to a word she says," he shouted to the room at large, turning his desperate eyes toward the tables of investors. "She forged that bank statement. She has been jealous of her brother since the day he was born. She is unstable. This is a sick, vindictive stunt to ruin the happiest day of his life, because she is a miserable, lonely woman." He was sweating profusely now, the expensive fabric of his tuxedo shirt clinging to his chest. He took a few steps toward the stage, but the security guards shifted their weight, a silent warning that kept him from coming any closer. He looked like a cornered animal, realizing that his charm and intimidation tactics were completely useless against hard, documented evidence. He turned to the men sitting at the prime tables, the men holding the financial lifeblood of his company in their hands. "Gentlemen, you know me?" He pleaded, his voice taking on a pathetic whining quality. "You know my business acumen. Do not let this hysterical girl poison your minds with fake internet printouts. She has always been a problem child." Then Chelsea stepped out from behind Jordan, her face twisted into an ugly mask of rage. Her dream of marrying into limitless wealth was disintegrating before her eyes, and she needed a target for her absolute terror. She pointed her manicured finger at me, her diamond ring flashing aggressively under the lights. "You are pathetic, Valerie," she screamed, her voice shrill and echoing painfully through the silent room. "You are just a bitter, jealous spinster. Look at you standing up there trying to destroy a beautiful marriage because no man has ever wanted you." She took a heavy step closer, her massive white wedding dress rustling loudly against the marble. "You have no husband, you have no real career, and you have no life, so you had to come here and invent this insane conspiracy theory to feel important. Jordan is a brilliant entrepreneur, and his father is a highly respected businessman in this community. You are just a sad, lonely paralegal who printed out some fake papers from the local library to get attention. Everyone in this room knows exactly what you are doing. We all pity you, Valerie. We really do." Her words were meant to cut deeply, to humiliate me in front of hundreds of people, but they just sounded hollow and incredibly desperate. She was projecting her own deep-seated insecurities onto me, trying to cling to the wealthy narrative she had so eagerly sold to her own bridesmaids and family. I watched her hyperventilate, her hands shaking violently as she desperately tried to convince herself that I was lying. She looked back at Jordan, expecting him to back her up, to step forward and defend his honor like a real man. But Jordan was completely frozen. He was staring at the floor, unable to meet anyone's eyes. His fake billionaire persona had entirely evaporated, leaving behind nothing but a scared little boy playing dress-up in a rented tuxedo. "Valerie, please," Vivian cried out, her voice breaking into a loud, pathetic sob that cut through the tension. My mother had finally looked up from her hands, and her face was a mess of streaked, ruined makeup. She stood up, leaning heavily against the table for physical support. "Please, just stop this right now," she begged, tears streaming down her cheeks. "Look at what you are doing to us. Look at the awful scene you are making in front of the entire church congregation. You are completely ruining our family image. We can talk about the past at home behind closed doors like normal people. You do not air dirty laundry in public like this. Have some respect for the family name. Think about what the pastor is going to say. The family name." Even now, as the absolute truth of her husband's thievery and her son's fraudulent life was laid bare, for the entire city to see. Her only concern was the fragile family image. She did not care that I had been robbed of my education and my future. She did not care that I had suffered for years under the weight of their emotional abuse and neglect. She only cared about what the wealthy women in her social circle were going to whisper about at Sunday service. She was more upset about the breach of etiquette than the breach of trust. I stood at the podium and let the wave of their collective panic wash over me. I did not interrupt them. I did not raise my voice to defend myself against Chelsea's petty childish insults or my father's frantic sweaty denials. I just stood there, in perfect stillness, a solid, unmovable object in the center of their swirling, chaotic storm. I let the wealthy investors at the front table see exactly who my father really was, a weak man who screamed and threw tantrums when cornered with the truth. I let everyone see the beautiful blushing bride turn into a vicious name-calling bully. I let them show the world their true ugly colors. The absolute silence I offered them was the most powerful weapon I possessed. It forced them to hear the pathetic echo of their own ridiculous words in the cavernous ballroom. Eventually, the dark energy drained out of their frantic attacks. Chelsea's loud screams faded into heavy, ragged breathing as she realized no one was taking her side. My father stopped pacing and leaned heavily against a marble pillar, looking exhausted and completely defeated. My mother sank back into her expensive chair, covering her face with her napkin once again. The massive room fell into a heavy, suffocating quiet. "Are you quite finished?" I asked, my voice smooth and utterly devoid of emotion. I adjusted the slender microphone slightly, making sure every single syllable would be captured perfectly by the sound system. "You can call me all the terrible names you want, Chelsea. You can scream about forged documents until your lungs give out Elias. You can cry a river about the ruined family image, Vivian. But the beautiful thing about raw data and official financial records is that they do not care about your hurt feelings. They do not care about your carefully crafted social standing, and they certainly do not care about your loud, aggressive denial." I opened the leather binder again and turned to the next page. I had allowed them their dramatic moment of desperate rebellion. I had let them exhaust their verbal ammunition. Now it was time to move past the ancient history lessons and address the devastating current reality. It was time to show them exactly how deep the hole they had dug for themselves truly was. My father thought his biggest, darkest secret was the stolen college fund. He had absolutely no idea that I knew every single detail about his current financial disaster. I looked directly at my mother, my eyes locking onto her tear-stained, trembling face. "I am not here to ruin the family image, Mother," I said softly. "I am here to explain to you that there is no family left to protect." I raised my left hand and gave a subtle nod toward the dark, arched doorway at the back of the room. My assistant Marcus, a brilliant financial analyst who had been waiting patiently in the shadows, stepped forward. He was pushing a sleek metallic cart, holding a high-definition laser projector. He moved with absolute precision, ignoring the bewildered stares of the wedding guests. Within seconds, he had connected his laptop and aimed the lens directly at the massive blank wall above the main wedding cake display. The wall had been draped in sheer white silk, intended to look like a fairy tale backdrop, but now it served a much darker purpose. Marcus pressed a button, and the entire wall lit up with blinding white light. Massive spreadsheets, bar graphs, and banking statements suddenly projected across the elegant silk, stretching 20 feet high. The bright blue and red ink of the financial charts clashed violently with the delicate floral arrangements below. The investors at the front tables immediately leaned forward, their eyes scanning the data with professional curiosity. My father let out a strangled gasp and reached out as if he could physically pull the images off the wall. I turned my focus away from my parents and locked eyes with my brother. Jordan was staring at the wall, his mouth hanging open in sheer disbelief. He had spent his entire life being shielded from consequence, and now his raw, unedited reality was being broadcast in high definition for the entire city elite to see. "Let us talk about the golden boy," I said, my voice projecting smoothly through the microphone. Let us talk about Jordan, the tech visionary. For the last 3 years, my family has built their entire social standing on the premise that Jordan is the next great Silicon Valley billionaire. My father has bragged to every single person in this room about his son's innovative software startup. He has used Jordan's imaginary success to leverage his own business deals and to make himself look like a master of generational wealth. Chelsea married him believing she was securing a future of private jets and endless luxury. I pointed to a massive pie chart dominating the left side of the projection. This is the official financial audit of Jordan's startup from the day it was incorporated up until yesterday afternoon, I said. Look closely at the revenue column, ladies and gentlemen. Look at the massive zero sitting right at the top. The ballroom remained perfectly silent as the guests digested the numbers. Jordan stood frozen, his fake confidence completely gone. He looked like a deer caught in the headlights. In 3 years, Jordan has not sold a single product. I continued, my words falling like heavy stones in the quiet room. He has not acquired a single paying client. He does not even have a working prototype of the software he claims to be building. His entire company consists of a rented office space in Midtown that he uses to play video games and a payroll that funds his luxury lifestyle. I gestured for Marcus to switch the slide. The screen flashed, and a detailed list of credit card expenditures appeared. Every single one of those business expenses was projected for the room to see. Let us look at what the tech CEO has actually been doing with his time, I said, stepping out from behind the podium so I had a clear view of his face. There are charges here for expensive steakhouses, exclusive nightclubs, and designer clothing, all written off as business development. He leased a brand new luxury vehicle under the company name just to impress a woman who thought she was marrying a billionaire. He is not a genius entrepreneur building the future. He is a 28-year-old man playing pretend on his father's dime. Chelsea let out a sharp gasp. She turned her head slowly to look at the massive list of expenses on the wall. She recognized the names of the restaurants and the luxury boutiques. Those were the places Jordan had taken her on their dates. He had told her he was using his massive corporate profits to spoil her, but the truth was staring her right in the face in bold red numbers. He was entirely broke. Jordan, you told everyone you were closing a $10 million venture capital round next week, I said, walking slowly toward his table. You told your blushing bride that the money was going to buy her a villa in Tuscany. You stood here 10 minutes ago and offered to pay my floral bill with your imaginary wealth. But we both know there is no venture capital firm. No legitimate investor would ever put a single dime into a company that has zero revenue and a CEO who spends his days buying expensive watches instead of building a product. Marcus pressed another button, and the screen zoomed in on a specific banking ledger. The numbers were massive and entirely printed in the deep red ink of severe debt. I walked back toward the stage to ensure every word I said resonated clearly. I want you all to look at the operational costs of this fake company, I instructed the room. Jordan has burned through over $3 million in the last 36 months. That is an astonishing burn rate for a company with absolutely no output. He hired his fraternity brothers as useless consultants, paying them 6-figure salaries to do absolutely nothing. He threw lavish launch parties for software that did not even exist. He flew private to tech conferences just to take pictures for his social media profiles, pretending to be a thought leader in an industry he knows nothing about. Chelsea was trembling so hard, her heavy diamond earrings were shaking against her neck. She took a step away from Jordan, physically distancing herself from the fraud. She had spent the entire morning bragging to her bridesmaids about her future life as a tech billionaire wife. She had mocked my emerald dress and called me cheap. Now she was staring at the undeniable proof that the man she had just sworn her life to was nothing but a hollow shell. Her perfect day was shattering right in front of her. You told her you were a king, Jordan, I said, my voice echoing relentlessly. You promised her an empire, but kings build their own castles. They do not steal from their sisters and beg their fathers to pay for their fake crowns. You are a fraud down to the very core of your being. You have never worked a hard day in your life. You have never faced a single consequence. You thought you could just fake it forever because our parents would always be there to clean up your mess. Jordan shook his head violently, his eyes darting around the room. He was looking for a way out, a way to spin the narrative, but the data was undeniable. Val, stop it, he whispered, his voice cracking. Please, just stop. You are ruining my life. You ruined your own life, Jordan. I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. I am just providing the subtitles. You have spent your entire adult life looking down on me. You mocked my job. You mocked my apartment. You sat back and smiled while our parents treated me like a second-class citizen because it meant you got to keep the spotlight. You let them steal my college fund to buy your way into a school you barely graduated from. And now you expect me to sit quietly while you lie to everyone in this room. The investors were whispering intensely among themselves now. They were looking at my father with deep suspicion, realizing that if he was willing to lie so blatantly about his son's success, he was likely lying about the health of his own company. The house of cards was rapidly collapsing. My father was clutching his chest, looking physically ill, as he watched his son's reputation being burned to the ground. But I was not done with the tech CEO just yet. The zero revenue was embarrassing, but it was only the beginning of the nightmare. The real tragedy was where the money to fund this massive fake lifestyle had actually come from. I looked back at the wall and gave Marcus another subtle nod. It was time to show Chelsea exactly who she had chained herself to, and time to show my mother the true cost of her blind loyalty. I turned my attention back to the massive projection on the wall. The bright numbers seemed to burn into the retinas of everyone in the room. I asked Marcus to bring up the final document for this part of our little presentation. A scanned copy of a thick legal contract appeared on the silk drapery. The heading was from a private equity firm known entirely for predatory shadow lending, the kind of firm that only deals with desperate people who have run out of all legitimate options. Jordan, you have been bragging all night about the $10 million venture capital deal you are closing next week, I said, keeping my voice perfectly level. You told Chelsea it was seed money from a prestigious firm in Silicon Valley. You told our mother it was proof of your brilliant business acumen. Let us take a closer look at what this document actually is. I stepped aside, pointing to the bold text at the top of the screen, so no one could miss it. It is not venture capital, I explained to the silent room. Legitimate investors require a viable product and actual revenue. Legitimate investors do rigorous due diligence. When Jordan was laughed out of every reputable venture capital office in the country, he panicked. He needed a massive influx of cash to keep playing the role of the wealthy CEO for his new bride and to fund this ridiculous wedding, so he turned to a shadow lender. A company that issues high-interest predatory loans. The annual percentage rate on this $10 million is a staggering 22%, with a balloon payment due in exactly 12 months. Chelsea let out a sound that was half gasp and half sob. She looked at Jordan, her eyes wide with a mixture of horror and absolute disgust. "You took out a loan," she whispered, her voice trembling so violently she could barely form the words. "You told me you were selling equity in your company. You told me we were going to be set for life and buying property in Europe." Jordan tried to reach for her hand to calm her down, but she violently recoiled, stepping further away from him, as if his touch would physically burn her. "It gets much worse, Chelsea," I said, making sure she heard every single word. "A shadow lender does not just hand over $10 million to a man with a zero revenue company and a history of maxed-out personal credit cards. They are predatory, not stupid. They require a ironclad guarantor. They require collateral, hard tangible assets that they can seize the moment the first payment is missed. And since Jordan owns absolutely nothing of value in his own name, he had to find someone who did." I slowly shifted my gaze to my mother. Vivian was sitting perfectly still, staring up at the screen. Her face had drained of all color, leaving her looking fragile and suddenly very old. She was squinting at the bottom of the projected document where the signature lines were displayed in stark black ink. My father Elias stepped forward, his hands raised in a desperate pleading gesture. The arrogant patriarch was entirely gone, replaced by a begging coward. "Valerie, please do not do this," he pleaded, his voice cracking under the weight of his terror. "Keep your mother out of this. She does not know. Please, I am begging you, do not do this to her in front of everyone." "But she needs to know Elias," I replied, my tone turning ice cold. "She needs to know exactly what her unwavering loyalty to you has cost her." I pointed to the signatures glowing brightly on the wall. There, in black and white, was my father's distinct, scrawling signature right next to Jordan's. "Your husband co-signed the predatory loan, Mother," I said clearly, making sure my voice carried to the back of the room. "But his failing logistics company was not enough collateral for a $10 million payout. The lender needed prime real estate, so without telling you, Elias leveraged the only piece of unencumbered property this family had left. He put up your house, the sprawling estate in Buckhead, the house you have lived in for 30 years, the house you spent your entire life decorating to impress your high society church friends. It is all tied to this loan." The room erupted into a cacophony of shocked murmurs. The wealthy investors at the front tables were shaking their heads in disgust, realizing Elias was completely financially ruined. Vivian slowly rose from her chair, her entire body trembling violently. She looked at Elias, her eyes filled with a raw, devastating betrayal that shattered her perfect facade. "You put up the house?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying a lifetime of pain. "You mortgaged my home for his fake company behind my back." Elias tried to step toward her, his hands outstretched. "Vivian, I had to," he pleaded, his eyes darting frantically around the room. He needed the money to keep up appearances for the wedding. I was going to figure it out. The logistics business was going to secure a new government contract, and I would pay it off before they ever came knocking. I was protecting our son. I was protecting the family name. "Protecting your son," I repeated, cutting through his pathetic excuses like a knife. "You signed away your wife's security to fund your son's delusions. And because Jordan's company has no income to cover the massive monthly interest payments, this loan will default within 90 days. When it does, the shadow lender will not hesitate. They will foreclose on the Buckhead estate immediately. You will be evicted from your perfect home, Mother. You will have absolutely nothing left." Vivian let out a gut-wrenching wail. It was the sound of a woman watching her entire identity turn to ash in a matter of seconds. She collapsed back into her chair, clutching her chest and sobbing uncontrollably. All her sacrifices, all the times she turned a blind eye to her husband's cruelty, all the times she threw me under the bus to maintain the perfect family image had been for nothing. Her reward for decades of complicity was complete financial ruin and public humiliation. Chelsea watched my mother fall apart, and the reality of her own situation fully set in. She had married into a family that was not just broke, but actively drowning in toxic predatory debt. She looked at her massive diamond engagement ring and then back at Jordan, suddenly realizing it was likely bought with stolen money or credit. Her face twisted into a mask of pure hatred. "You lied to me," she screamed, the sound piercing through the heavy atmosphere of the ballroom. "You are nothing. You are a broke, pathetic liar who just made your own parents homeless so you could play pretend." Jordan had nowhere to hide. He stood in the center of the wreckage he and his father had created, entirely stripped of his false bravado. The tech CEO, the golden child, the favored son, was now just a terrified fraud, staring at the shattered remains of his life. He looked at me, his eyes begging for mercy, begging for me to make it stop. But the ultimate blow, the one that would sever their remaining shreds of dignity and hand me the keys to their empire, was still resting quietly in my leather binder. Chelsea stood rigidly in the center of the ballroom, her eyes darting frantically across the faces of the wedding guests. The silence in the room was absolute, save for the sound of her rapid, shallow breathing. She looked down at the massive diamond engagement ring resting on her left hand. Just hours ago, she had held that hand up for the photographer, beaming with pride as she showed off what she believed was a symbol of her new status as a billionaire wife. Now she was staring at it with profound revulsion, realizing it was likely made of cubic zirconia or purchased with a maxed-out credit card. The psychological break happened slowly at first, and then all at once. She reached up and grabbed the delicate lace veil pinned into her perfectly styled hair. With one violent pull, she ripped it from her head, taking several hairpins and strands of blonde hair with it. The expensive fabric fluttered to the marble floor like a dead bird. Jordan took a panicked step forward, holding his hands up in a placating gesture. "Chelsea, please, sweetheart, calm down," he begged, his voice trembling with fear. "We can fix this. I can fix this. I know people in the industry. We just need a little more time to secure the real funding. Fix this!" Chelsea screamed, her voice tearing through the room with a raw, feral intensity. "How exactly are you going to fix $10 million of predatory debt, Jordan? Are you going to code a magical app tomorrow that pays off the house you just stole from your own mother? You made me sign a marriage license today. You stood at that altar, looked me dead in the eyes, and promised me a life of luxury while knowing you were completely financially ruined. You trapped me. You legally tied me to your massive sinking ship because you needed a pretty prop to make your fake life look convincing." She took another step toward him, her face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I bragged to all my friends about you," she sobbed, her chest heaving violently. "I told my family I was marrying into Atlanta royalty. I defended you when my father said your business model made no sense. I defended you because I thought you were a genius. But you are not a genius. You are a parasite. You have been feeding off your parents and projecting this disgusting fake confidence while you have absolutely nothing to your name." Jordan was physically shrinking under the weight of her words. He looked around the room, desperately hoping his parents would step in and save him just like they had done his entire life. But my father was leaning against a pillar, clutching his chest and fighting for air, while my mother was completely catatonic in her chair, staring blankly at the floor for the first time in 28 years. No one was coming to rescue the golden boy. "I love you, Chelsea." Jordan pleaded, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes and streaming down his face. "I did all of this for you. I wanted to give you the wedding of your dreams. I wanted to give you the life you deserve. Everything I did was because I wanted to be the man you thought I was." "Do not you dare put this on me!" Chelsea shrieked, taking both of her hands and shoving him hard in the chest. Jordan stumbled backward, his expensive shoes slipping on the polished marble. "You did not lie to your investors for me. You did not steal your sister's college fund for me. You did it because you are a pathetic, weak little boy who cannot handle the reality of being a complete failure. You love the way I look on your arm. You love the aesthetic of a beautiful blonde wife to complete your fake billionaire package. You do not know the first thing about love." At the back of the room, the guests seated at the tables reserved for the bride's family began to stand up. Chelsea's father, a stern man with a flushed face, marched across the dance floor toward the main table. He did not look at my father or my mother. He walked straight up to Jordan and looked at him with an expression of pure disgust. "If you ever come near my daughter again, I will personally destroy whatever is left of your miserable life," he said, his voice low and incredibly dangerous. He turned to Chelsea and gently placed a hand on her shoulder. "We are leaving right now," he told her. "I will have my lawyers file for an annulment first thing Monday morning on the grounds of severe financial fraud. This marriage is over before the ink is even dry." Chelsea did not argue. She looked at Jordan one last time, her eyes entirely devoid of the adoration she had shown him just hours earlier. She reached down to her left hand and grabbed the massive engagement ring. She pulled it over her knuckle, leaving a red mark on her skin, and threw it directly at Jordan's face. The heavy ring bounced off his cheekbone and hit the marble floor with a sharp metallic clink, rolling away under one of the dining tables. "Keep your fake jewelry," she spat, "and keep your fake life." She turned her back on him, picking up the heavy skirt of her custom wedding gown and walking away. Her father walked closely beside her, shielding her from the stares of the remaining guests. The sound of her heels clicking against the floor echoed in the silent ballroom, until Derek, the head of security, unlocked one of the heavy oak doors just enough to let them out. The door clicked shut behind them, sealing the rest of us inside the tomb of my family's destroyed reputation. Jordan fell to his knees right there in the middle of the dance floor. He buried his face in his hands, sobbing loudly and uncontrollably. The golden child was entirely broken, left with no wife, no money, no company, and no dignity. He looked up through his tears toward my mother, begging for comfort, but Vivian slowly turned her head away, unable to look at the son who had just cost her the only home she had ever known. The family unit that had prided itself on perfection and superiority was completely and permanently fractured. The air in the room was heavy with the stench of their collective ruin. I stood at the podium watching the wreckage with absolute calm, waiting for the final act to begin. The sound of Jordan weeping on the marble floor was the only noise left in the shattered ballroom. I stood at the acrylic podium, looking down at the wreckage of my family. My mother Vivian remained completely frozen in her chair, staring blankly at the empty space where her daughter-in-law had just been standing. She looked like a ghost trapped in an expensive designer gown. The wealthy guests and business investors at the front tables were murmuring quietly among themselves, already drafting the gossip that would spread through Atlanta high society by morning. But my father Elias was not ready to surrender. A man who has spent his entire life feeding off the fear and submission of others does not simply accept defeat. He has to fight until the very last breath of his ego is extinguished. I watched as Elias slowly pushed himself away from the marble pillar. His face was still pale, and his chest was heaving, but his survival instincts were kicking in. He reached up with trembling hands and straightened his silk bow tie. He pulled his tuxedo jacket down, trying to smooth out the wrinkles of his panic. He took a deep breath, and his posture shifted back into the arrogant, commanding stance he had used to terrorize me for 3 decades. He stepped over Jordan as if his weeping son was nothing more than a pile of discarded laundry. In a matter of seconds, Elias had completely detached himself from the boy he had worshipped his entire life. Jordan was no longer the golden child. Jordan was a liability, and Elias only cared about saving himself. Elias turned his back on his ruined family and faced the tables where his major investors were sitting. "Gentlemen, please." He began, his voice loud and artificially steady. He held his hands out in a gesture of open honesty, a politician trying to control a scandal. "I apologize for this deeply embarrassing family dispute. My son Jordan has clearly made some very foolish, very immature financial decisions without my full knowledge. He got in over his head trying to impress a woman. It is a tragic mistake of youth, but let me assure you it has absolutely nothing to do with the health and stability of my logistics corporation." The investors stared back at him with cold, calculating eyes. They were not buying it, but Elias was too desperate to stop. He forced a hearty chuckle that sounded hollow and grotesque in the silent room. "You all know me?" He continued, pacing slightly in front of the tables. "You know the empire I have built from the ground up. My company handles distribution for half the eastern seaboard. We have assets. We have government contracts in the pipeline. I will personally liquidate whatever is necessary to clear my son's ridiculous debt and buy back the deed to my house. This little hiccup will be handled by my legal team first thing on Monday morning. Our business ventures remain completely solid." He was lying through his teeth, and everyone in the room knew it. The financial data Marcus had projected on the wall clearly showed that Elias had co-signed the predatory loan because his own company was bleeding cash and entirely unbankable. But Elias was a master of delusion. He believed that if he said the words with enough authority, reality would simply bend to his will. When the investors did not respond, he turned his attention back to me. His eyes narrowed into dark, hateful slits. He marched toward the stage, stopping just short of the velvet stairs, his face twisting into a mask of pure venom. "And as for you, Valerie," he spat, his voice echoing sharply through the microphone that picked up his words. "You think you have accomplished something here tonight? You think because you hired some cheap graphic designer to project some stolen banking records on a wall that you have somehow defeated me? You are nothing but a petty, vindictive little girl throwing a tantrum because you have always been second best." He pointed a thick finger at my face, his upper lip curling in disgust. "You stand up there looking so smug with your credit card and your little speech. But let us look at the reality of who you actually are. You are a low-level legal assistant. You probably maxed out your life savings just to pay that floral bill to look like a big shot for 5 minutes. You are a lonely, bitter spinster who spends her days fetching coffee for real lawyers in New York. You have no real power, Valerie. You never have." I rested my hands on the edges of the podium, keeping my expression completely neutral, as his insults washed over me. His desperation was palpable. He was grasping at the old dynamics, the old insults, the old wounds, hoping he could hit a nerve and make me back down. "You are still that same pathetic girl who cried over a college rejection letter 12 years ago," he sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You think exposing my business decisions changes the fact that you were not smart enough or strong enough to get into Harvard. I threw that letter away because you did not deserve it, and you still do not deserve a seat at my table. You are a reject. You will always be a reject. I built an empire with my bare hands. I employ hundreds of people. I have real wealth, real influence, and real power in this city. You are just a parasite trying to drag us down to your miserable level because you have built absolutely nothing of your own." He took a step up the velvet stairs, his face flushed with renewed rage. "I am going to sue you for defamation, Valerie. I am going to have my attorneys drag you through civil court until you are completely bankrupt. I am going to make sure you never work in a law firm ever again. You came here tonight to destroy my family, but all you have done is sign your own death warrant. I am the CEO of this family, and I am the CEO of a multi-million-dollar corporation. You are just a pathetic little girl who is about to be crushed." Elias stood there, breathing heavily, staring up at me with absolute hatred. He had played his final hand. He had wrapped himself in his title and his supposed empire, believing it would shield him from the consequences of his actions. He genuinely believed that the corporate world would protect him, and that I was still just a powerless victim he could intimidate with a loud voice and empty legal threats. I looked down at him, and then I looked down at the red leather folder resting inside my binder. He had just given me the perfect introduction. He had just demanded that the room acknowledge his immense corporate power. It was time to show him exactly who owned that power now. I stepped away from the acrylic podium, leaving the microphone behind. The heavy silk of my emerald gown cascaded around my legs as I slowly descended the velvet stairs. I did not rush. I took my time, letting the sharp click of my heels against the marble floor dictate the heartbeat of the entire room. My father watched me approach his chest, puffing out in a pathetic display of dominance, but I could see the slight tremor in his hands. He stood his ground next to his empty table, waiting for me to shrink back into the obedient daughter he remembered. I stopped when I was less than 3 feet away from him. Up close, the smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the sour scent of his nervous sweat. "You are right, Elias," I said, my voice quiet, but carrying perfectly in the absolute silence of the ballroom. "I did not go to Harvard. When you threw away my acceptance letter and stole my college fund, you made sure I had to start from the absolute bottom. While Jordan was partying in a private dormitory paid for by your gambling money, I was working 18-hour days. I waitressed at a diner until midnight, and then I went back to a tiny unheated apartment to study until dawn. I fought for every single grade, every single credit, and every single dollar I earned at that state college." He sneered, looking down his nose at me. "And look where it got you," he mocked, trying to project his false bravado to the investors watching us. "A state degree and a desk in the back room of some miserable law firm." I smiled. It was a genuine, relaxed smile that seemed to unnerve him more than anything else I had done all night. "That is the story you told yourselves," I replied. "That is the story I allowed you to believe because it kept you from looking too closely at what I was actually doing. You see, the grit it took to survive your emotional abuse and your financial sabotage gave me an incredible advantage. It made me hungry. It made me absolutely relentless. While you were busy bleeding your logistics company dry to maintain your country club memberships, I was graduating at the very top of my class. And then I quietly submitted my applications to the top law schools in the country." My father blinked, his sneer faltering slightly as the confidence in my voice refused to waver. "I did not ask you for a single dime, Elias." I continued, taking one slow step closer to him. "I did not need your money or your influence because Yale Law School offered me a full-ride scholarship. They saw exactly what you refused to see. They saw a woman who could not be broken. I did not just get my basic law degree. I stayed and I earned my doctorate in corporate law. I am a doctor of jurisprudence from one of the most elite academic institutions on the entire planet." Vivian, who had been crying quietly in her chair, suddenly stopped. She lowered her hands and stared at me, her mouth slightly open. The daughter she had written off as a complete failure, the daughter she had allowed her husband to discard, had secretly achieved the highest level of academic success imaginable. The wealthy church ladies at the front tables exchanged shocked, wide-eyed glances. Vivian had always prized social status over everything else in life. Hearing that her daughter was a Yale graduate should have made her beam with maternal pride, but instead it terrified her. She realized in that exact moment that she had backed the wrong child. She had sacrificed the true genius of the family to coddle a complete fraud. Jordan had stopped his pathetic weeping and was staring up at me from the cold marble floor. His red, swollen eyes were wide with disbelief. He had spent his entire adult life pretending to be a wealthy intellectual, but he was staring at the real thing, and it paralyzed him. "But academia was only the beginning," I said, keeping my eyes locked firmly on my father. "You love to talk about power, Elias. You love to throw around your title as the chief executive officer of a logistics company. You told everyone I was a lowly paralegal fetching coffee for real lawyers in New York. You wanted me to be a nobody so badly that you never bothered to do a simple background check on your own flesh and blood. You just assumed I was exactly what you wanted me to be." I reached into the leather binder I had carried down from the stage and pulled out a thick premium business card. I held it up between my index and middle fingers. The thick black cardstock was embossed with a silver logo that every single investor in that room instantly recognized. When I moved to New York, I did not take a job fetching coffee, I told him, my voice dropping to a low, dangerous register. I went straight to Wall Street. I specialize in corporate restructuring, hostile takeovers, and aggressive debt acquisition. I spent the last 5 years dismantling failing companies run by arrogant, incompetent men exactly like you. I am not a legal assistant, Elias. I am the senior managing director of mergers and acquisitions at Vanguard Equity. The name dropped into the room like a live grenade. Vanguard Equity was not just a financial firm. It was the absolute apex predator of the global financial world. They were famous for swooping in and swallowing heavily indebted corporations, stripping them down, and liquidating their assets without an ounce of mercy. The wealthy investors at the front tables practically recoiled in their seats. They knew that if Vanguard Equity was involved in any capacity, there was no negotiating, and there were no second chances. Vanguard did not make deals. Vanguard conquered. My father physically staggered backward. His knees seemed to buckle for a fraction of a second before he caught himself against the edge of the dining table. His eyes were wide with sheer, unadulterated terror. He looked at the silver logo on the business card I was holding, and then looked up at my face, searching desperately for a lie. He found nothing but cold, hard, unforgiving truth. Vanguard. He whispered, his voice entirely devoid of its former arrogance. It was a weak, breathy sound like the last gasp of a dying man. "You work for Vanguard." "I do not just work for them, Elias," I corrected him smoothly, taking immense pleasure in the way he trembled. "I am a senior partner. I sit on the Global Executive Board. I personally control billions of dollars in liquid capital. When a company mismanages its funds, defaults on its loans, and tries to hide its insolvency from the federal government, my team is the one that steps in to clean up the mess. And we are very, very good at our jobs." He stared at me, his mind violently struggling to process the massive paradigm shift. The fragile little girl he had bullied for decades, the woman he had just threatened to destroy in civil court, was actually sitting at the highest pinnacle of global finance. She wielded more power before her morning coffee than he had accumulated in his entire pathetic life. "You ask the room to acknowledge your immense corporate power." "Elias," I said, stepping right into his personal space, forcing him to look directly into my eyes. "You threatened to bankrupt me just 5 minutes ago. But you cannot bankrupt the person who owns the bank. You cannot destroy the woman who holds the axe of the executioner." I let the reality of my true identity sink deep into his bones. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive tuxedo feeling like a suffocating straitjacket. The room was entirely silent, watching the great patriarch realize that he was completely outmatched, outclassed, and outgunned by the daughter he had thrown away. The truth of who I was stood out in the open, but the real punishment, the financial guillotine, was still waiting to fall. I lowered my hand holding the Vanguard business card and prepared to deliver the final killing blow to his fragile empire. I placed the thick black card down on the marble table right next to the floral invoice Chelsea had thrown at me earlier. I looked at my father, watching the arrogant patriarch finally shrink into the terrified little man he truly was. "You stood here tonight and told these investors that your logistics company is a massive corporate powerhouse," I said, my voice carrying a quiet, lethal calm. "You told them you have government contracts in the pipeline and endless valuable assets, but we both know that is just another desperate, pathetic lie. The truth is, your company has been bleeding cash for over 5 years. You lost your 2 biggest distribution contracts last spring because you were too busy playing high-stakes poker to oversee your own supply chain. You mismanaged your fleet, your drivers went on strike, and your profit margins completely evaporated. To cover up your massive incompetence, you did what you always do, Elias. You borrowed money. You went to the major commercial banks and you took out tens of millions of dollars in operational loans just to keep the lights on. You used your remaining trucks and warehouses as collateral. You thought you could simply outrun the crushing interest rates by securing one big magical contract that was never actually going to materialize. But commercial banks are not like your wife Vivian. They do not turn a blind eye to your failures just to keep the peace at the dinner table. When you started missing your quarterly payments last year, the banks flagged your accounts. 6 months ago, you officially defaulted on your primary commercial loans. My father squeezed his eyes shut, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table so tightly his knuckles were completely white. He was silently begging me to stop talking, but I was not going to stop until the entire structure of his lies was burned to the ground. The investors at the front tables were sitting in absolute stunned silence. They were witnessing a real-time corporate execution, and they could not look away. When a company defaults on massive commercial loans, the banks do not just sit around waiting for a miracle, I explained, stepping back, so the entire room could hear the mechanics of his destruction. They cut their losses quickly, they bundle that toxic debt, and they sell it to private equity firms at a steep discount to get it off their books. They sell it to firms exactly like Vanguard Equity. We specialize in distressed assets. We buy the massive debt of dying companies, and then we aggressively restructure them or liquidate them entirely to extract our maximum profit. 3 months ago, a massive portfolio of defaulted logistics debt was offered to my specific division at Vanguard. It was a standard Tuesday morning when my junior analysts placed the heavy file on my massive glass desk in Manhattan. I opened it and started reading through the corporate structure of a failing distribution company based in Atlanta. I saw the long list of leveraged assets. I saw the gross mismanagement of company funds. And then I turned to the primary guarantor page, and I saw your signature, Elias. I saw the name of the man who threw away my Harvard acceptance letter, staring right back at me from a legal document confirming his absolute financial ruin. Any other executive might have handed the file off to a subordinate due to an obvious conflict of interest. I said, a cold, hard smile touching my lips. But I did not. I took personal ownership of your portfolio. I instructed my team of ruthless corporate lawyers to purchase your bad debt immediately. But I did not just buy the commercial loans from the major banks. I wanted everything you had. I spent the last 12 weeks meticulously tracking down every single cent you owe to anyone in this entire country. I bought the financing contracts for your delivery trucks. I bought the commercial mortgage on your operational warehouses. I even sent my team to track down the shady shadow lender who gave Jordan that ridiculous $10 million loan, and I bought that paper too. Vanguard Equity now legally owns every single piece of your financial existence, Elias. You do not owe the banks anymore. You do not owe the shadow lenders. You owe me. I am your sole creditor. My father opened his eyes and looked at me with a hollow, devastated expression. He finally understood the sheer magnitude of what I had done. He was not just facing a standard bankruptcy. He was facing a financial guillotine operated by the daughter he had spent his entire life torturing and dismissing. You tried to hide your insolvency from your own board of directors, I continued relentlessly. You manipulated your quarterly earnings reports to make it look like the company was still viable. But when Vanguard acquires a distressed asset, we do not just look at the surface numbers. I sent my best forensic accountants to audit your ledgers. They tore through your fake spreadsheets in a matter of hours. They found the hidden accounts where you were siphoning company funds to pay off your personal gambling markers. They found the illegal borrowing against your own employee pension funds. You are not just a terrible businessman, Elias. You are a corporate criminal. The men sitting at the investor tables were furiously typing on their phones now. They were pulling their funding, canceling their upcoming meetings, and severing all ties with my father before federal investigators could start looking into their associations with him. Elias watched them abandoning ship and let out a pathetic sound that was somewhere between a sob and a gasp for air. When we consolidated all of your debt under Vanguard, we restructured the terms of your repayment. I explained, my voice perfectly steady. We instituted a strict cross-default clause across all of your accounts. Do you know what that means, Elias? It means if you miss a single payment on any of your obligations, whether it is the truck financing or Jordan's predatory loan, every single piece of your debt goes into immediate default simultaneously. And you missed a payment last Friday, I stated softly, letting the words hang in the silent room. You were so focused on funding this lavish $250,000 wedding for your fake billionaire son that you ignored the final legal notice from my corporate office. You bounced the check to this venue and you missed your consolidated loan payment. The trap was perfectly set, and you walked right into it without even looking down. I unclasped the heavy brass button of my leather binder and pulled out the thick red folder I had been carrying all evening. The color seemed to bleed into the sterile white of the tablecloth as I dropped it directly in front of him. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the marble table echoed like a judge bringing down a gavel. My father stared at the bright red cardstock as if it were a venomous snake ready to strike. He did not reach for it. His hands remained tightly gripping the edge of the table, his knuckles stark white against his dark skin. Go ahead and open it, Elias, I instructed, my voice devoid of any warmth. Open it and read the first page. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously against his tight collar. With trembling fingers, he reached out and flipped the cover open. The document on top was printed on heavy legal paper bearing the official seal of the state of Georgia and the unmistakable letterhead of Vanguard Equity. The bold black letters across the top read, "Notice of immediate asset seizure and transfer of controlling shares." He read the words, but his brain seemed incapable of processing their meaning. He looked up at me, his eyes bloodshot and wide with a desperate pleading look I had never seen before. "What does this mean?" he whispered, his voice breaking into a hollow rasp. "It means you are out of time," I replied, taking a step back to address both him and the silent room. "When you defaulted on the consolidated loan last Friday, Vanguard invoked the acceleration clause. The entire balance of your debt became due immediately. And since we both know your corporate accounts are completely empty, the collateral clauses were automatically activated. That red folder contains the legal transfer documents for every single asset you pledged to the banks." I pointed to the documents spread out before him, making sure every word landed with devastating precision. "As of 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, Elias, you no longer own a logistics company. You do not own the fleet of delivery trucks. You do not own the commercial warehouses. You do not own the corporate headquarters in downtown Atlanta. I own them. Vanguard Equity has officially seized your entire portfolio and placed it under my direct managerial control. I am the legal owner of the empire you built." He shook his head violently, stepping away from the table as if the documents were physically burning him. "No!" he shouted, his voice cracking into a pathetic whine. "No, you cannot do this. I am the founder. I am the chief executive officer. The board of directors will never allow a hostile takeover like this. They will file an injunction. They will tie you up in litigation for years. I have allies, Valerie. I have friends on that board who will fight you tooth and nail to keep you out of my company." I let out a soft, genuine laugh that sent a visible shiver down his spine. "Your friends on the board, Elias. You mean the same men you lied to about your quarterly earnings, the same men whose corporate reputations you put at severe risk to cover your underground gambling debts. Do you really think they are going to sacrifice their own lucrative careers to save a sinking ship?" I stepped closer, leaning over the table so I was at eye level with his crumbling facade. "I flew down to Atlanta 3 days ago," I told him, keeping my voice low and lethal. "While you were busy helping Jordan pick out floral arrangements and tasting vintage champagne for this ridiculous wedding, I was sitting in a private, secure conference room with your entire board of directors. I showed them the forensic audit my team conducted. I showed them the stolen pension funds. I laid out the exact federal prison sentences each of them would face under embezzlement statutes if they tried to protect you. I gave them a very simple choice. They could either vote to remove you immediately and cooperate with the Vanguard transition team, or I would hand the unredacted audit over to the federal authorities and let them all go down for corporate fraud as your direct accomplices." My father stopped breathing. The last shred of color left his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His jaw trembled uncontrollably as he realized the sheer scope of my retaliation. "It was a unanimous vote, Elias," I said, delivering the final, devastating blow. "They did not even deliberate. They threw you to the wolves without a single second thought, just to save their own skin. You were officially ousted as the chief executive officer of the company at 4 o'clock yesterday afternoon. You do not have a company. You do not have a title. You do not have a corner office to go to tomorrow morning. Your corporate keycard has already been deactivated, and the security guards at the lobby desk have strict legal orders to physically escort you off the premises if you even attempt to enter the building." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. The great patriarch, the man who had terrorized his family and demanded unquestioning obedience for 3 decades, was completely and entirely broken. He collapsed into his heavy dining chair, his body folding inward like a deflated balloon. He buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking violently as the reality of his absolute ruin finally crushed him. He had spent his entire life valuing power, status, and money over his own flesh and blood. Now he had absolutely nothing left to his name. The illusion of his vitality and strength was tied entirely to his bank account and his title, and without them he was just an old, frail, terrified man. Vivian, who had been listening to every single word, let out a long, trembling sigh. She looked at the man she had sacrificed her daughter for, the man she had defended and enabled for 30 years. He was not a strong leader. He was not a wealthy provider. He was just a pathetic, broken criminal who had dragged her down into the abyss with him. "You did this to yourself, Elias," I said, looking down at his shaking form without a single ounce of pity. "You threw away my future because you were terrified I would outshine your golden boy. You built your entire life on a fragile foundation of lies, theft, and manipulation. I did not destroy your empire. You handed me the matches and practically begged me to light the fire." The wealthy investors at the front tables, the men Elias had desperately tried to impress all night, began to quietly stand up. They did not say a word to him. They did not offer any condolences or promises of help. They simply gathered their expensive coats and walked silently toward the exit, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of his life. My father did not even look up, as his supposed friends abandoned him right there on the ballroom floor. I looked over at Jordan, who was still sitting on the marble floor, surrounded by the scattered remnants of his fake billionaire life. He was staring at the red folder on the table, his eyes glazed over with pure shock. He realized that the well had finally run dry. There would be no more financial bailouts. There would be no more luxury cars or fake venture capital rounds. The man who had funded his delusions was completely bankrupt, and the sister he had mocked his entire life now held the keys to their entire existence. But the transfer of power was still not complete. They had lost the company, they had lost their status, and they had lost their social standing. But there was one final asset listed in that red folder, one final piece of absolute leverage that I needed to address before I walked out of this toxic family dynamic forever. I reached out and tapped my manicured fingernail against the thick red cardstock, drawing their horrified attention back to the table. "The logistics company was just business," I said softly. "But the next item on this list is deeply personal." I flipped the thick, heavy page of the red folder, exposing a document printed on cream-colored linen paper. The seal at the top did not belong to a bank or a logistics company. It was the deed of trust for a massive real estate holding firm. I looked around the magnificent ballroom, taking in the crystal chandeliers, the towering floral arrangements, and the imported marble floors. My father followed my gaze, his eyes darting nervously around the room he had rented to prove his wealth to the world. "This estate is widely considered the crown jewel of Atlanta high society," I said, my voice projecting clearly into the cavernous space. "You bragged to everyone who would listen that you dropped $250,000 to secure this venue for your golden boy. You told the church congregation that only a man of your immense stature could even get on the waiting list. You paraded around this room tonight acting like a king in his castle. But as we have already established, Elias, you are a man who builds castles on sand." I stepped away from his table and walked slowly toward the center of the empty dance floor. My emerald gown dragged softly across the marble, a quiet sound that seemed to echo in the dead silence of the room. "When your initial deposit check bounced 3 days ago, the venue manager was legally obligated to cancel the event. He tried to call you repeatedly, but you ignored his calls because you knew you did not have the funds to cover it." The manager was furious. He immediately escalated the situation to the corporate ownership group that manages this property to get authorization to lock the gates and leave your guests stranded on the highway. My father swallowed hard, his face slick with cold sweat. He knew about the bounced check, but he had assumed his name and reputation had magically smoothed things over. He had no idea how close he had come to total public humiliation before the wedding even started. He had spent the last 3 days dodging phone calls and hoping the problem would just disappear the way his problems usually did when he threw a tantrum. "What you did not know, Elias, is that the corporate ownership group managing this property is a direct subsidiary of Vanguard Equity," I explained, turning back to face him. "Vanguard does not just buy corporate debt. We buy prime real estate." When the manager escalated the bounced check, the authorization request landed squarely on my desk in New York. I was sitting in my office looking at a formal request to lock you, Jordan and Vivian, out of this estate. I had the power to end this entire charade right then and there. I could have let your wealthy friends arrive in their expensive cars, only to find the iron gates chained shut, with a notice of non-payment pasted to the brick walls. Vivian let out a soft, horrified gasp. The thought of her church friends being turned away at a locked gate because of a bounced check was a social nightmare she could barely comprehend. She looked at the walls of the beautiful ballroom, suddenly realizing they were standing inside a trap that I had built. She had spent months bragging to her friends about this venue, treating it as the ultimate symbol of her family's superiority. Now it was the ultimate symbol of her defeat. But I did not lock the gates. I continued pacing slowly across the polished marble. I approved the event. I personally wired the $250,000 from my own private accounts to cover your bounce checks, your catering costs, and your premium hazard fees. I paid the manager. I paid the security team. I paid for the exorbitant floral arrangements. I even paid for the expensive jazz band that was playing when your new daughter-in-law decided to throw a floral invoice in my face and demand that I contribute to the family. Jordan was shaking his head slowly back and forth, his hands clutching his ruined tuxedo jacket. The lavish fairy tale wedding he had promised Chelsea, the event he had used to stroke his own massive ego, had been entirely funded by the sister he had mocked and discarded. The realization that he was standing on a stage I had constructed for him completely shattered his mind. He was not a billionaire. He was a charity case living entirely off my secret generosity. Why my father choked out his voice, sounding like dry leaves crushing underfoot. Why would you pay for all of this if you were just going to destroy us? Because canceling the wedding would have been too easy, I replied, my tone completely devoid of mercy. If I had locked the gates, you would have just invented another lie. You would have told everyone there was a scheduling conflict or a plumbing emergency. You would have played the victim, and Jordan would have continued pretending to be a tech billionaire. You would have found a way to spin the narrative to make yourself look like the hero. I needed you to step inside this room. I needed you to surround yourselves with the most powerful people you knew. I needed you to feel the absolute height of your own arrogance before I tore it all down. I swept my arm out, gesturing to the locked oak doors and the towering walls. You stood in my building drinking my champagne, and you tried to tell me I was a worthless spinster. Chelsea threw a bill at me while standing under a roof that I own. You ordered my security team to physically drag me out of my own property. The sheer audacity of your delusions is almost impressive, Elias. But the reality is that every single breath you have taken in this building tonight was by my grace and my permission alone. The room was completely dead silent. The remaining guests were too terrified to even breathe too loudly. They were trapped inside a fortress owned by a woman who had just systematically dismantled a corporate empire without breaking a single sweat. My father looked around the ballroom, and the beautiful architecture suddenly looked like the bars of a prison cell. He was a trespasser in his daughter's kingdom. The golden boy, the enabling mother, and the toxic patriarch were completely stripped of their illusions. I looked over at Derek, the head of security, who was standing by the main doors. He gave me a single respectful nod, acknowledging who held the ultimate authority in the room. As of this moment, the wedding reception is officially over, I announced, my voice ringing with finality. You have no company, Elias. You have no home, Vivian. And you have no fake empire, Jordan. The only thing you have left is the crushing weight of the debt you created. I suggest you gather whatever dignity you can still carry and walk out those doors. Because if you are still standing on my property in 5 minutes, I will have Derek and his team physically escort you out to the street like the common trespassers you have officially become. My father tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He reached up a trembling hand and clutched the fabric of his expensive tuxedo shirt right over his heart. A sharp gasp escaped his lips, echoing loudly in the silent ballroom. His face, which had been ashen gray, suddenly flushed a dangerous shade of purple. He staggered backward, his knees giving out completely, and he collapsed heavily into the mahogany dining chair. He let out a low, agonizing groan, leaning forward and resting his head on the cold marble table. It was not a heart attack, but it was a severe panic-induced angina. It was the physical manifestation of a man whose entire universe had just collapsed in on him all at once. For my entire life, whenever my father showed even the slightest sign of discomfort, my mother would rush to his side. She would fetch him water, rub his shoulders, and soothe his massive, fragile ego. But tonight, Vivian did not move a single muscle. She sat in her chair staring blankly at the man clutching his chest. She realized that comforting him would not bring back her mansion in Buckhead. It would not restore her standing in the church or erase the humiliation she had just suffered in front of her high society friends. The transactional nature of their marriage had finally been laid bare, and the account was entirely overdrawn. She looked at him with an expression of pure empty disgust. With Elias incapacitated and the remaining guests fleeing toward the exits like passengers on a sinking ship, Jordan was left completely alone. He looked at the heavy velvet doors, where his bride had disappeared earlier, leaving his fake diamond ring resting somewhere under a table. He looked at his mother, who was completely dead behind the eyes. And then he looked up at me. The golden child, the boy who had been handed the world on a silver platter, was finally forced to face the sister he had spent his life stepping on. Jordan scrambled to his feet, but his legs were shaking so badly he could barely stand. He stumbled across the few feet of marble separating us, and before I could even step back, he dropped to his knees right in front of me. The loud thud of his kneecaps, hitting the polished stone, echoed through the empty dance floor. He reached out and grabbed the hem of my emerald gown, his fingers digging desperately into the silk. "Valerie, please." He sobbed, his face slick with tears and sweat. "Please, you have to help me. You have to. Chelsea is gone. Dad is ruined. The shadow lenders are going to come after me personally when the company defaults. I have nowhere to go. I have no money. You own everything now. You are the head of the company. Please just give me a job." I looked down at the top of his head, feeling a strange mixture of disgust and absolute vindication. The billionaire tech CEO, the man who had bragged about a $10 million investment just an hour ago, was now literally begging for a paycheck on the floor of his own wedding reception. "I will do anything, Val," he pleaded, looking up at me with red swollen eyes. "I will start at the very bottom. Put me in the mailroom, let me be a junior analyst. I can learn. I am smart. You know I am smart. I just need a chance to prove myself. I will work for minimum wage. Just please do not leave me out on the street. You are my big sister. You are supposed to protect me." I reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off my dress. I stepped back, forcing him to look up at me from his pathetic position on the floor. "Protect you." I repeated the words, tasting like ash in my mouth. "Did you protect me when you let Dad steal my college fund? Did you protect me when you sat at this very table an hour ago and told your wife I was a lowly paralegal who could barely afford rent? You did not want a big sister Jordan. You wanted a punching bag. You wanted someone to stand in the shadows so your mediocre light could look a little brighter." I looked at his tear-stained face and shook my head. "Vanguard Equity does not hire frauds, Jordan," I told him, my voice steady and completely devoid of emotion. "We hire the best minds in the world. People who actually studied. People who earned their degrees. People who did not have their acceptances bought with stolen money. You have absolutely no skills, no work ethic, and no integrity. You would not last a single afternoon in my mailroom, let alone in a corporate office." "But we are family," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. "You cannot just abandon your own blood." "I am not abandoning you, Jordan," I replied smoothly. "I am simply returning the exact same energy and investment you have given me for the last 30 years, which is absolutely nothing." He slumped forward, resting his hands on the marble floor, completely defeated. He had spent his entire life playing a rigged game, and now that the board had been flipped, he had no idea how to survive. He was a 28-year-old man who had never faced a single consequence, and the real world was about to hit him with the force of a hurricane. I turned my attention back to Elias, who was still breathing heavily at the table holding his chest. The great Elias, the self-proclaimed king of Atlanta logistics, was gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. The sharp pain in his chest was the crushing weight of his massive ego collapsing under the gravitational pull of his own lies. He squeezed his eyes shut, waiting for anyone to offer him a lifeline. But the ballroom was rapidly emptying. The wealthy investors had already slipped out the side doors, eager to distance themselves from a man who was not only bankrupt, but a documented corporate criminal. The members of my mother's church were practically sprinting toward the valet stand, terrified that acknowledging our family would somehow infect their own social standing. Even the catering staff had stopped pouring champagne. They stood near the kitchen doors, watching the wealthy family self-destruct in real time. The only sounds left in the $250,000 venue were the ragged breathing of my father, the pathetic sobbing of my brother, and the sharp, authoritative footsteps of Derek and his security team moving into position. 5 minutes are up, I said, my voice carrying across the room. Clear the room, Derek. Derek approached my father's table, his expression completely unreadable. Sir, he said, his voice firm and professional. The owner has asked you to vacate the premises. I need you to stand up and walk toward the exit immediately. My father opened his eyes and glared at the security guard. Do not you dare touch me, he hissed, though his voice lacked any real venom. I am leaving. He forced himself to stand, leaning heavily on the table for support. He looked at Vivian, expecting her to take his arm and help him walk out with whatever shredded dignity they had left. But Vivian simply picked up her designer clutch and stood up, keeping a wide berth between herself and her husband. She walked past him without a single glance, heading toward the massive oak doors alone. She was a woman who had just lost her mansion, her social standing, and her entire identity, and she blamed the man gasping for air next to her for every single bit of it. Jordan scrambled to his feet, wiping his nose on the sleeve of his expensive rented tuxedo. He looked at me one last time, a desperate, pleading look in his eyes, hoping I would change my mind and hand him a lifeline. But my face remained a mask of stone. I had spent 12 years building an impenetrable fortress around my heart, and his tears were not nearly enough to breach the walls. Derek gestured toward the door, and the three of them began the longest walk of their lives. The golden boy, the toxic patriarch, and the enabling mother, moving slowly across the empty dance floor. They looked small. They looked pathetic. They were stripped of their titles, their bank accounts, and their illusions. The toxic empire they had built on my back had been completely leveled, and I was standing perfectly upright in the center of the ruins. Derek and the security team stood firm as the three of them dragged their feet toward the exit. But just before they reached the heavy oak doors, my mother stopped. Vivian turned around and looked back at me, standing alone in the center of the massive ballroom. She let go of her designer clutch, letting it drop to the marble floor. She walked slowly back across the room, leaving Elias and Jordan by the exit. Her face was streaked with ruined makeup, and her shoulders slumped under the weight of her sudden poverty. She stopped a few feet away from me, looking up with eyes that begged for a sudden reversal of reality. Valerie? She whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and desperate manipulation. You have made your point. You have shown us how powerful you are, and we are sorry. We are so sorry for everything, but you cannot do this. You cannot just throw us out into the street. We are your family. I am your mother. I carried you for 9 months. I raised you. You have to forgive us because blood is blood and family sticks together no matter what. She reached out, trying to grab my hand, but I took a smooth step backward. Her fingers grasped at the empty air. She was using the exact same emotional blackmail she had used my entire life. She was trying to weaponize the biological connection between us to shield herself from the consequences of her own horrific choices. She wanted me to believe that sharing DNA somehow obligated me to absorb her toxicity and fund her extravagant lifestyle. I looked at her crying face and felt absolutely nothing. The well of empathy I used to hold for her had completely dried up 12 years ago. You stood by and watched my father steal my future, I said, my voice low and dangerously calm. You watched him emotionally abuse me for decades. You sat at that table tonight and told me to apologize to the man who ruined my life, just so you could keep up appearances with your wealthy friends. You do not get to invoke the word family now that you have lost your mansion, Vivian. Family is not a free pass to abuse someone and demand their financial support when you have exhausted all your other options. You enabled every single terrible thing Elias ever did to me because it kept you comfortable in your luxury home. But you are my daughter, she wailed, her tears falling onto the expensive silk of her dress. You cannot just cut off your own flesh and blood. Think about what people will say. Think about the church. God will judge you for turning your back on your parents. You have so much money now, Valerie. It would not cost you anything to just pay the loan and let us keep our house. I tilted my head slightly, observing her pathetic display of selfishness. Even now, standing in the wreckage of her life, she only cared about what the church congregation would think and how she could spend my money. I am not turning my back on my parents, I replied. I am finally establishing the boundary you should have respected decades ago. And as for blood, I want you to remember this for the rest of your life. Blood is just a biological accident, Vivian. Loyalty is what makes a family. You gave your loyalty to a man who stole from me and a son who lied to you. You chose your side a long time ago. Now you get to live with the people you chose. I did not wait for her to formulate another manipulative response. I turned my back on her, the emerald silk of my gown sweeping heavily across the floor. I walked toward the back of the ballroom, heading for the private exit where my driver was waiting. I could hear her sobbing behind me, calling my name over and over again, begging me to come back and fix the mess she had helped create. But her voice grew fainter with every step I took. For the first time in 30 years, I was not walking away in defeat. I was walking away in absolute victory. Derek opened the heavy doors for my parents and my brother, and the sound of the heavy locks sliding into place behind them was the most beautiful music I had ever heard. The scene shifted drastically the next morning. The bright morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my 50th floor office on Wall Street. The chaos and the toxic emotional manipulation of the Atlanta estate felt like a lifetime ago. I stood behind my massive glass desk looking out over the sprawling skyline of Manhattan. The city below was a hive of endless ambition and relentless momentum, perfectly matching the energy I had cultivated inside myself. I was wearing a sharply tailored navy blue suit, my hair pulled back into a sleek professional style. I was in my element, surrounded by the silent power of a billion-dollar corporate empire I helped command. On the corner of my desk sat a small, unassuming piece of paper. It was a faded copy of the Harvard acceptance letter my father had tried to destroy all those years ago. I had tracked down the admissions office records a few years into my corporate career and requested a copy just to prove to myself that I had actually earned it. For a long time, that piece of paper had represented all the grief and the stolen potential of my youth. It was a reminder of the life my father had taken from me to protect his own fragile ego. But standing there in the morning light, I realized that the letter held absolutely no power over me anymore. The Ivy League name did not build my resilience. The rejection from my family did not define my worth. The fire they forced me to walk through had simply forged me into a weapon they could never defeat. I picked up the piece of paper, feeling the texture of it between my fingers one last time. I did not feel any sadness or regret. I walked over to the heavy-duty industrial paper shredder sitting near the corner of my office. I pressed the power button, and the machine hummed to life. Without a single second of hesitation, I fed the Harvard letter into the metal teeth. The machine buzzed loudly instantly, shredding the painful symbol of my past into hundreds of tiny, meaningless strips. It was gone. The past was completely erased, and the future belonged entirely to me. I walked back to my desk and looked directly forward. If you are a woman watching this, and you have spent your life shrinking yourself to fit into the tiny toxic boxes your family built for you, I need you to listen to me very carefully. You do not owe your success to the people who tried to bury you. You do not owe your forgiveness to people who only apologize when they have lost their power over you. Society will try to tell you that family is everything, that you have to tolerate abuse simply because you share the same bloodline. But that is a lie, designed to keep you trapped in a cycle of suffering. You have the right to walk away. You have the right to build your own empire, and you have the absolute right to lock the doors behind you. Your worth is not determined by the parents who failed you or the siblings who tried to outshine you. Your worth is forged in the silent battles you win when no one else is watching. I took my power back by refusing to play their game and by quietly building a life so massive they could never tear it down. Have you ever had to draw a hard boundary with a toxic family member to protect your own peace and your own future? How did you finally break free from their manipulation? I would love to read your stories in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of absolute resilience and ultimate payback. Share this video with any woman who needs to be reminded that she is not crazy, she is not overly sensitive, and she is absolutely allowed to demand the respect she deserves. Thank you for staying with me until the very end. Keep building your empire, keep protecting your peace, and never ever apologize for surviving.